What we're going to be looking at today is the war in Ukraine and basically where the public stands. I mean, we get a lot of insight on what, elites and people who are really into these issues happen to think about what's going on in Ukraine, but we don't necessarily get to hear the voices of people in Ukraine, which we'll be getting to hear through some of our research today, but also what global public opinion thinks about what's going on in Ukraine, and also what's happening in the United States. And we're going to have a very interesting panel on that a little bit later. I just wanted to thank the Institute for the Study of War and our friends, the Kagans, for participating in this event today. It's a joint event between Ipsos and the Institute for the Study of War. We'll also be joined, I think at some point, I don't think she's here yet, by Her Excellency Oksana Markarova, who is the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, and she'll certainly be on the panel to discuss what's going on in terms of public opinion. As I said before, the interesting thing about all of this is that public opinion tends not to necessarily be brought into the war, into the discussions of the war, I think in a systematic way. There's a lot of assumptions about what people are thinking around the world about what's going on relative to things, everything from sanctions against the Russians through to support for activities in Ukraine. And so what we've done is we've looked at it in three different ways. One of them is to look at global public opinion. Another one is to look at what people are thinking in the United States. But we're also are fortunate enough today to have some of our Ukrainian colleagues from Ipsos in Ukraine who are going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening in Ukraine, along with some work that Mark Poliak did in Ukraine on public opinion and what's happening in some specific parts of Ukraine. So that's basically our agenda today. My job is to introduce this, which I've done. And then the second thing is to give you some insight on what's happening in terms of global public opinion and what people are thinking. Now, Ipsos has done a lot of research on global public opinion. We do a survey every month in at least 30 countries in which we look at a wide variety of different issues. But we also did a couple of major surveys, one specifically on the war in Ukraine that we've just either just releasing or have already released. And also I've integrated some data that we have here from a survey that we did for the Halifax International Security Forum that we've been tracking for 12 years to look at how public opinion has changed over time on issues related to international security. So that's we'll look at what's happening in Ukraine relative to what people's opinions are about international security issues. So to get us kicked off, and by the way, I should say that everything that I'm going to show you today is available on the website that you can find with the whatever those symbols are called, QR code that you'll see on various signs around the room and in the reception area. So if you want to find any of the public opinion data, that's where it is. So let's start with something that we track every month, and we've been doing this for a dozen years. And it's a list of what we call what worries the world. So it's a question that we ask on anywhere up to 40 countries every month about what the most important issues are in the world. What concerns you the most? So number one is inflation. And now what real people call inflation is cost of living. So how much does it cost you to get by from day to day or from month to month? Top of the list. And what we've seen is a really almost a one-for-one correlation between the decline in concern about COVID and the rise in concern about inflation and cost of living. Now, I should also say that inflation isn't just a function of what's happening generally in people's lives, but there's probably some element of the war in Ukraine that is affecting this number and is helping to drive this number higher. And then you'll see an entire list of other issues. And you'll see on a red bar here, military conflict between or among nations. So when you look at the war, not a lot of people see that as a priority or a primary issue. And one of the things that you're going to see consistently through all of these data, it's a question of propinquity. It's a question of nearness in space. The closer you are to the war, the more that you're concerned about it in terms of physical space. The other thing is there's another element to security that's playing relative to this issue of concern about military conflict between nations, and that's the issue of Taiwan. So you'll see in some of the Asian countries that there's actually a significant amount of concern about potential for violence between nations. So it's not just about Ukraine, there's also an issue that's confronting the world relative to Taiwan. So something that we've asked over time, and this is from the Halifax Security Forum data, over the last year has the world become a more dangerous place? And the majority of us think it has slightly become a more dangerous place, but they always think the world's a dangerous place. We saw a bit of a slight dip in 2018, but since that point, I mean, we've seen a fairly steady increase. Not huge, but you know, people think the world is a dangerous place. And who thinks the world is most dangerous? Well, it's interesting. It's a mix of people who have local conflicts, like Peru, but also people who have this existential fear about what might be happening in other places. Now, the green number here connotes a place where this has actually increased over the space of the last year. And you'll see it's a lot of NATO countries. Again, closeness to what's happening in Ukraine, but also places like Australia. And that's obviously not specifically related to Ukraine. I've got Canada and the United States marked out here. 87% of Americans think that the world has become a more dangerous place, but that's a pretty consistent number over the last dozen years. What about the fear of a world conflict involving a military superpower similar to World War I or World War II over the next 25 years? Yeah, the vast majority of the world, almost 3/4 of us, think that there's potential for that. Again, taking a look at the ones that are all in green, they're mostly the countries that are close to what's happening in Ukraine, adding in Taiwan. So Australia obviously has moved up quite a bit on this. But the biggest movers, South Korea has moved up on this. But the biggest movers typically are NATO countries. Bit of a noisy slide, but this is something that we ask, and I've tracked it back here to 2015. We have a list of security threats that we've developed with the Halifax International Security Forum, things that people think are actual threats. This could potentially happen in my country, and I'm worried about it. Number one, by the way, consistently over time and growing, has been concern about being personally hacked. So if you want to get people worried about security issues, this one's very personal. And there's enough news about that out there that you can understand why. Major health epidemic. As you can see, back in 2021 and 2020, COVID dominated the list and has come down significantly. Major natural disaster, consistent over time. Nuclear, chemical, and biological attack is one of the big movers this year. It's moved up 9%. So not directly involved in a war in a situation, but potentially collateral issues that could affect you. Terrorism goes up and down depending on what's going on in the news. Personal safety of your family, a violent conflict breaking up among ethnic or minority groups in your country, fairly consistent over time. And then we've seen a slight rise in the percentage saying your country entering into an armed conflict with another country. So the big mover has been things related to potential collateral effects. Country being involved in an armed conflict. By the way, not shocking that the United States is at 74%. They tend to be near the top of the list every time we ask this. But again, NATO countries. And some others. Japan up 23% on this one. And that's not necessarily Russia, or what's going on in Ukraine, that's also Taiwan. Nuclear, biological, or chemical attack, who's worried? Well, everybody's worried about it, but the big movers are countries like Japan, Sweden, Germany. And you'll see Germany's consistently high on just about everything that we ask relative to Ukraine. Confidence in your government's ability to deal with an armed conflict, not that high. Only 44% of us worldwide. The Indians are feeling pretty confident. The Turks are feeling pretty confident. The United States is feeling pretty confident, but just about everybody else not very confident all the way down to Argentina. Only 24%, and declining. And nuclear, biological, or chemical attack, everybody feeling, basically that their government's not really up to the task, including 50% of Americans. Bottom of the list, Belgium this time. World influencers, this is something that we ask for the Halifax Security Forum, and it's fascinating to me every year. Because depending on what's going on in the news, your number goes up or your number goes down. We've seen 3 big moves over the space of the last 10 years. The first big move, interestingly, was the United States when it elected Donald Trump. If you take a look at the U.S. in terms of its influence, going to have a positive influence on the world affairs, it took a big hit at the time of the election of Donald Trump. The next year after that, it took another hit, almost 14 points in total. And then when Joe Biden was elected, bounced back almost the exact same amount. And this is, as I said before, global public opinion. The next big mover was China due to COVID. And now we've had another big mover, and it's Russia, and it's due to what's happened in Ukraine. But the thing about Russia is, as you can see, 29% still think that Russia can have a positive impact on what's going on in the world. So these opinions aren't universal. Depending on where you live, you have one opinion or another.
45% for Saudi Arabia, sorry.
No, there's a whole list. You can read it for me if you like. Go ahead. Yeah, Saudi Arabia doesn't do well. Israel doesn't do well. Who's at the top of the list? My country, Canada, but they're the best meeting conveners going. But Germany does pretty well, France does pretty well, and I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the biggest increase has been for Great Britain, but also for NATO. And Saudi Arabia has gone up a bit, just a little bit. World influencers on Russia, thinking about the next decade. Would you say Russia will have an overall positive influence? So this is the previous question. And as I said before, even though Russia's taken a fairly big hit, even in countries that support it, the 2 largest countries in the world still have pretty positive opinions about Russia. So 70% of people in India and 74% of people in China. Where they do worst, obviously, is in NATO countries. At the bottom of the list is Poland. So in response to this, do you think there needs to be an increase in military spending? This is the biggest move I've ever seen in this number. Usually it's going in the other direction. But as a result of everything that's happening in the world today, 64% think there needs to be an increase in military budgets, and it's a universal number. There's been increases just about everywhere. Again, especially in places like NATO countries. So how much attention are you paying to the invasion of Ukraine globally? So in terms of your opinions of issues that are dominating the world agenda, how much time are you dedicating to thinking about what's going on in Ukraine? Compared to inflation and increasing prices, climate change and severe weather, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is fairly obviously not getting as much attention. And who's paying attention? Interestingly enough, places like India, who knows why, but also countries that are NATO countries and countries that could be affected by what's going on in Taiwan, again, because they see these issues as, to a certain extent, being interlinked. The United States, Cliff's going to talk a bit about the U.S., but kind of a middling type of issue. About 60% of people saying that they're paying attention, fairly close to the global average, actually a little bit below. And these are the countries with the strongest opinions on the war in Ukraine. So I'll just quickly go through this list. My country should avoid getting involved in militarily in this conflict. 71% think that, especially if you live in Hungary and Malaysia. And Hungary consistently through this is a very reluctant country about engagement in what's happening in Ukraine. My country must support sovereign countries when they're attacked by other countries. About 70% of us think that, fairly consistently around the world. Restrictions on Russian oil and gas imports are important to maintain, even if it means we must limit our heating this winter. 67% agree with that, but not if you're a Hungarian. And if you're a German, you're somewhat more reluctant than average on that question. My country should take in Ukrainian refugees from the current conflict. 2/3 of us think that we should be, especially if you live in Great Britain or Netherlands. Not in Indonesia or Singapore, but they're not really seeing any Ukrainian refugees anyway. Russia must continue to be excluded from major international sports competitions. Americans particularly feel that point of view, as do the British and the Polish, but Indonesians and Mexicans not so sure. Given the current economic crisis, my country cannot afford to lend financial support to Ukraine. 64% think that. But Malaysians and South Africans, they're the highest on that. The Netherlands and Sweden, you know, they're more supportive. Again, NATO countries close to what's going on. Doing nothing in Ukraine will encourage Russia to take further military action somewhere in Europe or Asia. 63% think that, especially if they live in Great Britain or Australia. Again, Australia, collateral effect on what's happening in China, with China. Paying more for fuel and gas because of sanctions against Russia is worthwhile to defend another sovereign country. Half the world thinks that, but not if you live in Chile or Colombia. The problems of Ukraine are none of our business and we should not interfere. Only 42% of the world population thinks that. The people who are least likely to believe that we should be interfering are in India, Hungary, and Thailand. Again, Hungary's an interesting country, consistently holds this opinion. But if you live in the Netherlands or Sweden, yep, we should be doing more. This is a very noisy chart. All I'm going to point out to you, and you can look at it in detail a little later, but the ones in red and big reds and blues are the ones that are the big movers. Where we've seen some reluctance is in the area of refugees and people thinking that their country should be accepting refugees, particularly in places that are probably experiencing this, like Belgium and Germany. Where we've seen some increase in numbers is the problems of Ukraine are none of our business and we should not be interfering. So there's sort of consistent support for what's going on, but it's loosening up a bit, I would say. Even in countries like Germany, which is up 11 points on that. Turkey's up 13. Continuing on, continue to support Ukraine until all Russian forces have withdrawn from our territory, 57%, especially Sweden and Great Britain. Again, Hungary reluctant on this, but so is Italy. Applying the most stringent economic sanctions against Russia, less than half of the global population supports that. But if you live in Great Britain and Sweden, you think it's a better idea. Turkey and Malaysia, not so much. Providing weapons or air defense systems to the Ukrainian military, only 37% of the world thinks that. But again, it's the NATO countries. Great Britain, Canada, Sweden, places that are less close to the conflict, they're not so sure. Maintaining diplomatic ties with Russia, Poland, Canada, and Spain say, no, we shouldn't be. Americans, obviously, as you can see here, 33% not thinking that they should be. Indonesia and India, not so sure. Limiting or restricting imports of oil and gas from Russia, even if this leads to steep increases in energy and food prices. This is where you start bumping into real reluctance. And finally, the one that gets a lot of discussion these days, sending troops to Ukraine. Very few people support doing that. Only a quarter. So, to summarize, there's a fear of armed conflict between nations is a mid-tier issue. COVID as a threat has been replaced by cost of living or inflation in terms of top public concern in the world. The war in Ukraine has increased fear in the world, especially in countries closest to the conflict. The global public is watching, but not that intensely. The closer you are, that propinquity question, the more interested you are in this issue. There's a contributing factor that we need to fold into this, which is people living in Asia Pacific who are worried about what's going on in Taiwan and what kind of a precedent what's going on in Ukraine sets for what conditions of a potential conflict there might be. There's an increased fear of nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks. So people aren't as afraid of direct engagement with what's going on in Ukraine, but potentially what might happen there could potentially affect them as a collateral effect, as I was mentioning before. There's ongoing resolve to support Ukraine, but more challenging when it comes to personal sacrifices, like paying for the cost of energy and also accepting refugees has gotten a little wobbly over the last while. There's little global support for sending troops to the Ukraine, and there's no doubt when you look at the data that Russia's global reputation has taken a considerable hit due to the invasion. NATO's reputation is slightly improved, but as I said before, these feelings are not universal. The two largest countries in the world do not, even though Russia's reputation has come down a bit with them, strong majorities still support Russia. So anyway, thank you very much. That's the global public opinion environment. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Cliff Young, who will talk to you about the U.S. Thank you.